You think babies are born as blank slates with no consciousness? Modern neuroscience has discovered something that challenges everything we thought we knew about infant awareness. In groundbreaking research on early brain development, scientists found that consciousness doesn't suddenly switch on at birth. It emerges through a fascinating developmental process that begins earlier and unfolds in more complex ways than anyone predicted. These researchers studying newborns and infants weren't observing empty vessels waiting to be filled with experience. They were documenting sophisticated consciousness already actively processing reality in ways we're only beginning to understand. The most remarkable part? The science reveals that the first months of life involve neurological and psychological transformations so profound they literally shape how you'll experience reality for your entire existence. This isn't speculation or philosophy. It's documented neuroscience about how human consciousness actually develops from its earliest emergence. And understanding this process reveals why your first experiences, even before memory forms, continue influencing your psychology decades later. Not every moment of early development affects consciousness equally. There's a critical difference between the biological processes that support consciousness and the emergence of consciousness itself as subjective experience. Neuroscientists observe that newborns have functioning sensory systems. They can see, hear, feel. But the question of whether they have subjective awareness, the felt experience of being someone perceiving these sensations, is more complex. Some researchers argue consciousness emerges gradually through the first year, as neural networks develop the integration that creates unified experience. Others present evidence that basic awareness exists from birth, or even before, but develops in sophistication and self-awareness over time. This isn't about souls or supernatural claims. It's about the genuine scientific mystery of when and how the biological brain generates the subjective experience we call consciousness. What appears as a simple question from outside reflects extraordinarily complex neuroscience involving brain development, sensory integration, and the emergence of self. Real research on infant consciousness reveals both what we've learned and how much remains unknown about the origins of human awareness. In this video, I'm going to reveal what modern neuroscience and developmental psychology have discovered about how consciousness emerges in human infants, the stages of awareness development in the first years of life, and why these earliest experiences shape your psychology permanently even though you don't remember them. You'll discover what we actually know about infant awareness versus what remains mysterious, how the brain develops the capacity for consciousness, and what the research reveals about the relationship between early experience and lifelong psychological patterns. These are insights from neuroscience, developmental psychology, and consciousness studies about how human awareness actually begins. By the end, you'll understand the real science of infant consciousness development and why your earliest months created neural patterns that still influence you today. This isn't a video about souls, past lives, or supernatural pre-birth states. This is neuroscience and developmental psychology explaining how consciousness emerges through documented biological and psychological processes. This video is for people curious about the origins of human awareness, parents want to understand their infant's experience, or anyone interested in how the brain develops the capacity for consciousness. If you've wondered when babies become conscious, what they're actually experiencing, or how early life shapes psychology permanently, you're about to discover what the research actually shows. If you're ready to understand the real science of how human consciousness begins, keep watching. Think about your earliest memory. For most people, it's from around age 3 or 4, maybe a birthday, a significant event, or a vivid moment. But here's what neuroscience reveals. Your consciousness existed for years before your first memory. You were aware, processing experience, learning, forming attachments, and building neural structures that still influence you today, all before you could remember any of it. This phenomenon, called childhood amnesia, isn't about lacking consciousness. It's about how memory systems develop separately from awareness. You were conscious as an infant, experiencing reality through sensation, emotion, and perception, but your brain hadn't yet developed the systems that encode explicit memories you can later retrieve. The psychological weight of this pattern is profound. Your earliest experiences shaped your developing consciousness, created neural patterns for how you process emotion and relationships, and established foundations you're still building on. But you have no conscious access to when these patterns formed. Research on infant consciousness reveals that we're all living with psychological structures created during years we don't remember, by a consciousness that existed before our sense of continuous self emerged. Developmental neuroscience provides a framework for understanding how consciousness emerges through stages in the first years of life. At birth, the newborn brain has most neurons it will ever have, but relatively few connections between them. Consciousness, as far as neuroscience has determined, emerges not from neurons themselves, but from the patterns of connection between them. The first stage researchers identify is sensory consciousness, present from birth or shortly after. Newborns respond to light, sound, touch, temperature. They have sensory experience, even if we can't know exactly what that experience feels like subjectively. Brain imaging shows that sensory cortex areas activate when infants receive sensory input, indicating processing is occurring. The second stage is perceptual consciousness, emerging in first months. Infants begin integrating separate sensations into coherent perceptions. They recognize faces, track objects, differentiate sounds. This requires neural networks connecting different sensory areas, allowing the brain to create unified perceptions from multiple inputs. Around 2 to 3 months, infants show evidence of expectations. They're surprised when physical laws are violated in experiments, suggesting they're building mental models of how reality works. The third stage is affective consciousness, emotional awareness present very early. Newborns experience and express basic emotions, distress, contentment, interest. By 2 to 3 months, they show social smiling, indicating emotional connection. The limbic system, which processes emotion, develops early and remains highly active throughout infancy. Infants are emotionally conscious beings from the beginning, even if other aspects of consciousness are still developing. The fourth stage is self-consciousness, emerging gradually through first 2 years. This involves recognizing yourself as a separate entity, as the subject of experience. The famous mirror test, recognizing yourself in a reflection, is typically passed around 18 to 24 months, suggesting self-awareness has reached significant threshold. But components of self-consciousness emerge earlier: body awareness, sense of agency, I cause things to happen, and distinction between self and other all develop gradually through infancy. The neuroscientist Stanislaus Dehaene studied consciousness extensively and proposed that infants have what he calls access consciousness, awareness of sensory and emotional information, but develop reflective consciousness, awareness of being aware, gradually through childhood. His research using brain imaging suggests that by 5 months, infants show neural signatures consistent with conscious processing of visual information. They have awareness, even if it's different from adult consciousness. The developmental psychologist Alison Gopnik studied infant cognition and described babies as having lantern consciousness, diffuse awareness of everything around them, versus adult spotlight consciousness, focus attention on specific things. Her research suggests infants are conscious, but experience reality differently. They're aware more simultaneously, but with less ability to focus and filter. This isn't less consciousness. It's different consciousness adapted to developmental needs of learning about everything at once. The psychologist Jean Piaget documented cognitive development stages, describing how infants construct understanding of reality through sensory motor experience. His work showed that consciousness in infancy involves active learning. Babies aren't passive receivers, but active explorers using every sense and movement to build understanding of physical and social reality. The neuroscientist Patricia Cole studied how infants process language and found that by 6 months, babies have learned the sound patterns of their native language, demonstrating rapid learning that requires conscious attention to patterns in speech. Her research revealed that infants are actively processing linguistic information, learning unconsciously but consciously attending to voices around them. Insider knowledge from consciousness research reveals the central mystery. We can document what infants' brains are doing, what behaviors they show, what they're learning, but we cannot directly access what their subjective experience feels like. We know they're conscious, but we can't fully know how they're conscious. But here's what research reveals about the specific aspects of infant consciousness development and why early experience has such profound, lasting impact. The first crucial finding is that infant consciousness is embodied, deeply connected to physical sensations and needs. Newborns experience hunger, cold, pain intensely because their consciousness hasn't developed the regulatory mechanisms that allow adults to endure discomfort. Every sensation has immediate emotional significance. Distress is total, comfort is complete. This creates what researchers call immediacy of experience. Infants live entirely in the present moment because they haven't developed the cognitive capacities for past/future orientation. Their consciousness is now, and now contains everything. The second finding is about attachment and social consciousness. Research by Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby documented that infants develop specific attachments to caregivers in predictable patterns, and these attachment styles affect relationships throughout life. Attachment research reveals that infants are conscious social beings from the start, forming emotional bonds that shape their developing sense of self and relationships. The quality of these earliest relationships literally wires neural networks for how you'll process social connection forever. The third finding involves emotional regulation development. Newborns cannot regulate their emotional states. They depend entirely on caregivers to provide regulation by responding to distress, offering comfort, maintaining optimal arousal levels. Through thousands of interactions, infants gradually internalize these regulatory capacities. Their consciousness learns to modulate emotion through the co-regulation provided by attachment figures. This process creates individual differences in emotional regulation that persist into adulthood. Your capacity to manage your own emotions was originally learned through how others manage emotions with you when your consciousness was first forming. The fourth finding is about implicit memory and procedural learning. Even though infants don't form explicit memories they can later recall, they're constantly forming implicit memories, patterns of how things work, what to expect, how to respond. These implicit memories shape consciousness without being consciously accessible. You learn whether the world is safe or threatening, whether needs get met reliably or unpredictably, whether relationships are secure or anxious, all before you could remember learning it. These patterns became your baseline for interpreting reality. The fifth finding concerns sensory integration and body awareness. Infants are learning to coordinate multiple senses, to understand that the visual object and the tactile object are the same thing, to map their own bodies in space. This sensory integration is literally consciousness learning what the self is, learning the boundaries between you and not you. Problems with sensory integration create lasting differences in how consciousness relates to physical reality. The sixth finding is about the critical periods for different aspects of development. Visual consciousness develops rapidly in first months. Infants who don't receive adequate visual input during this period may have permanent visual impairments, even if their eyes work physically. Language consciousness has critical periods where the brain is especially plastic for learning language structures. Attachment has sensitive periods where formation of secure bonds is most crucial. These critical periods reveal that consciousness development is time-sensitive. Certain capacities must develop during specific windows, or they develop incompletely. The seventh finding is about the role of interaction in consciousness development. Isolated infants, those who don't receive adequate social interaction, show impaired development across multiple domains. Consciousness doesn't develop in isolation. It develops through interaction. Your awareness of being a self emerged through others treating you as a self, through the thousands of reciprocal interactions where caregivers responded to your expressions as meaningful communication. Human consciousness is fundamentally social from its origins. The transformation that understanding this research creates is recognizing that your earliest experiences, even those you don't remember, shaped fundamental aspects of how you experience reality now. Remember patterns you notice in yourself, how you respond to stress, what triggers anxiety, how you approach relationships, whether you fundamentally experience the world as safe or threatening. Research reveals these patterns often originate in pre-verbal development, created during the years when your consciousness was forming, but before you could form explicit memories. Your attachment style, whether you're secure or anxious, avoiding relationships, was largely established by age 2 based on patterns of interaction with caregivers. These aren't just behavioral patterns. They're embedded in the neural networks that process social information. Your emotional regulation capacities were learned through co-regulation in infancy. If your distress was consistently met with soothing, you developed strong self-soothing capacities. If it was met inconsistently or with further distress, you developed weaker regulatory systems. Your baseline stress response, how quickly you become dysregulated, how intensely you experience emotion, reflects early experiences your consciousness doesn't remember but your nervous system stored. Your sense of safety or threat in the world often reflects whether your infant consciousness experienced the environment as reliably meeting needs or as unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. Even your cognitive style, whether you approach the world with curiosity or caution, exploration or withdrawal, was influenced by early experiences that shape how your developing consciousness engage with novelty and challenge. Understanding this isn't about blaming parents or dwelling on the past. It's about recognizing that you're living with neural patterns created when your consciousness was first forming, and that these patterns to be understood and, to some extent, modified through awareness and therapeutic work, even though you can't remember when they formed. Now here's where the research reveals its most practical significance, and where understanding infant consciousness development transforms from interesting science to personally relevant insight. The patterns established when consciousness first emerges aren't fixed forever, but they are foundational. They create baseline patterns that require significant work to modify. Here's what the research suggests about working with patterns established in preverbal development. First, recognize that cognitive insight alone doesn't change these patterns because they were encoded before cognitive/verbal processing fully developed. They're held in implicit memory, in emotional systems, in body-based responses. Changing them requires approaches that work with these systems. Somatic therapies, emotion-focused approaches, attachment repair work rather than just cognitive understanding. Second, understand that these patterns were adaptive originally. Your infant consciousness developed response patterns that helped you survive in your specific early environment. Anxious attachment made sense if caregivers were inconsistent. Staying visually connected improved your chances of getting needs met. Your patterns aren't defects. They're adaptations to early conditions that may no longer fit current circumstances. Third, accept that you're working with foundations laid when your consciousness was first forming. This takes patience. You're not just changing habits, but rewiring neural networks that have been operating for decades. But the research also shows that neuroplasticity persists throughout life, meaning these patterns can be modified even though they were established very early. Fourth, recognize the power of present relationships to provide corrective experiences. If early attachment was insecure, secure relationships now can gradually create new neural patterns through the same mechanism that created the original ones. Repeated experiences of different responses. Your consciousness remains open to learning from relationship throughout life, even though early relationships were especially formative. The research on infant consciousness development ultimately reveals something profound about human experience. We all carry within us years of conscious experience we cannot remember, patterns of being that were established before we had words to describe them, and fundamental orientations to reality that were shaped by interactions we have no explicit memory of. This isn't mystical or supernatural. It's documented in neuroscience and developmental psychology. Your first years created the foundation for consciousness you experience now, and understanding this helps explain patterns that might otherwise seem mysterious or mutable. If you struggle with attachment issues, emotional regulation, stress responses, or baseline anxiety, understanding that these often originate in preverbal development provides both explanation and pathway for healing. These aren't personal failures or defects. They're neural patterns established when your consciousness was first developing, shaped by circumstances you had no control over. They can be understood, worked with, and to a significant degree modified through approaches that reach the implicit, emotional, and somatic systems where they're stored. The research validates both the profound impact of earliest experience and the continued plasticity that makes growth possible throughout life. In the next video, I'm going to reveal what developmental psychology and neuroscience show about the critical periods in early childhood, the specific windows when different aspects of consciousness and capability are most sensitive to experience, and what this means for both child development and understanding your own psychological patterns. Until then, recognize that your consciousness carries the imprint of years you don't remember, that those years shape fundamental patterns still operating now, and that understanding this is a first step toward working with rather than being unconsciously controlled by early foundations. Subscribe if you want to understand the complete science of how consciousness develops from infancy through adulthood, including how early patterns persist and how they can be modified to inform psychological work.